And we're live. It is Saturday, July 18th, 2020. July 18th means we are now officially
Steve is
the
here.
uh, in the middle of the worst month of the summer. So I guess that was really when on the 15th, but I didn't really notice it then. But now I really am impressed by the fact that we're in the middle of July. July is the hottest month of the year, at least in the mid-Atlantic states. So we're in the thick of it. And, you know, I don't really have much more to say about it than that. I'm sitting here at the cabin in the woods. It's not that unpleasant here. I have a beer. Uh, so I have very little to complain about. I have two dogs here. And I have a 3D printed baby cannon pointed at the long-suffering bottle of baby Prosecco, and we will be blowing that up at the end of the episode.
I think I should bring the baby on to watch the baby cannon pointing at the baby Prosecco. It just seems like the tautology of it all is like too good.
Yeah. Do you want to? Should we? Yesterday we had a baby chipmunk display. Today we're going to have baby Prosecco and baby cannon. Maybe we should have an actual baby on the show. How is the baby chipmunk, by the way?
Oh, baby chipmunk's great. Actually seems to be doing much better and is like running around and stuff. So is going back into wilderness very soon, like tomorrow.
Excellent.
About 5 miles from my house, as recommended by one of our listeners.
So we are bringing in Steve Vladeck. And this time he came in. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Steve.
Oh, you're muted. Let's unmute you.
I love the many stages of like unmuting of like sign language and like it's kind of like 2 syllables.
We could do a whole conversation with Steve Vladeck just in mime.
Yes, exactly. This is my chance to make fun of the Mets. You can't talk back to me. This is for 1986.
Well, while Steve is sorting out his audio, let me just say that we are not allowed to have fun anymore. And in lieu of fun, the first thing we have to decide is whether the unnamed, unidentified law enforcement officers in Portland, Oregon are better described as little green men, which has the appropriate, garb associated with it, or whether it's better described as Basiji, which has the kind of Iranian operating domestic thing going on for it. I'm getting a little feedback on myself now.
I think it's because Steve's mic just turned on.
Hello. Can you hear me?
There we go.
We can hear you, Steve.
Oh my gosh, it's a miracle.
We can also hear ourselves.
All right, I'll turn myself down. Hold up. How's that? Better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Much better. Yeah.
How are you?
I'm, surviving life. This is 2 little kids who, have a limited range of activities and a limited amount of self-sufficiency makes life challenging. But
indeed,
we're on to our second screen time patch of the day, which frees me up to come and hang out with you fine people.
Excellent. Well, welcome. What do you think? Are the Portland federal law enforcement anonymous better described as little green men or better described as Basijis?
I was thinking it more as like Ken Cuccinelli's Private Army, but whatever works, I think is works.
All right, where do we start with this thing?
Well, set the stage, I think, a little bit. Let's can we just talk about like what the heck? For the 50 days there have been protests in Portland, Oregon, because there have been 50 days of protests because of George Floyd, and now just as kind of like Charlie Rozelle summed up yesterday, just because it seems to have become a little bit the culture of what to do in a pandemic and no one has anything to do. And so there's like this culture of protest that has slowly grown over 50 days, but also there's like a desire to see change and the type of reform that happened in Minnesota.
Right.
That like these things are still going on. But sometime around the 4th of July, it's now decided, the president decided that kind of to like take aim Portland and took Portland as a personal insult to him in some way, like the fact that these protests were happening, and supposedly has sent in, not supposedly isn't even the right word, maybe he just has sent in federal law enforcement to deal with the protest problem. The problem is that there are reports that these federal law enforcement are running around in kind of combat camo without names attached to them, with vague descriptions like police on their camo, and putting people into unmarked vans. And so that's like the long and the short of it, right?
So I would add a couple things, Kate. I mean, I would just add that there have been some documented instances of both property damage and of assaults on police officers. So I know there's at least one episode where actually someone from Texas, apparently a white supremacist from Texas, has been charged with physical assault against a member, I think, of the U.S. Marshal Service, but I may have the exact agency wrong. So, yes, this is predominantly peaceful protest, but not exclusively. And I think that that's worth stressing because I think that is both important context and also a foil that many of the federal officials are using to justify what, may be sort of to some degree a justifiable response, but maybe a grossly disproportionate response in the aggregate.
You also know about like the Proud Boys and like the white supremacists, since you mentioned that, like that there have seemed, do you know about that either, Ben? Like I read when I was reading up on all of this and making sure I had my facts straight, it seemed like there has been a counter protest presence of Proud Boys and white supremacists at these. Is that consistent?
It's not, nothing is consistent. I think it's fair to say that there is, particularly in Portland and Seattle, some of the protesters are kind of, anarchists with desire to have, a kind of police-free autonomous zone kind of thing. There are other groups that show up, or other individuals who are white supremacists who are trying to stoke violence to, provoke the race war that they believe is inevitable. And then there's, I think, also just incidents of property damage and vandalism that are, have happened sporadically over the course of this thing. I think it's probably a mistake to describe it as more organized than it is, but it's fair to say that there are a lot of groups and a lot of individuals who are doing their thing for their own reasons. Is that fair, Steve?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think part of what complicates the sort of the reaction, especially from afar, is that there's no one dominant theme here, right? That there are overlapping, skewed different groups with different agendas. And so I think, the part of, I think, what's going on is that whoever's responsible for the violence is, providing at least enough of a lever, right, for a federal response. I think the other thing is there is, I think, widespread frustration, although I think blame is pointed in different places, about the response of the city of Portland to the protests to date. I think there is a sense that the Portland police have not exactly helped the situation, while the sort of civilian elected officials have largely sort of stayed out of things. So, I think this is an incredibly complicated situation. And one of my real concerns is that the federal officials who are on Twitter, like thumping their chests, are taking advantage of the confusion and the complexity to try to sort of, that is actually emboldening, right, the federal response in ways that if there were a clearer picture about what was going on and who was responsible, it might actually be harder.
So what do we know, like, let's just list the facts that we know about the federal response. What do we know about who's there and under what legal authority?
So let's start at the beginning, right? Which is there's always a core of federal law enforcement officers in the city of Portland, because there are a handful, I think somewhere 7 or 8 federal buildings downtown. And so with that comes a couple of different agencies. The Federal Protective Service is the principal law enforcement agency that's responsible for the protection of federal buildings, especially outside of D.C., but also in D.C. too. 3 of those buildings are courthouses. 2 of them are active federal courthouses. So then we also have to talk about the U.S. Marshal Service. There's obviously FBI in Portland, right? So Ben, we start from the sort of premise that there was already federal law enforcement in Portland as part of their job. What seems to be going on, and this is, I think, becoming a little bit clearer thanks to public statements by 3 officials, by acting Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf, by acting CBP Commissioner Mark Morgan, and by, although he calls himself acting Deputy Secretary Ken Cuccinelli, he is not legally the acting Deputy Secretary, so let's just call him the senior official performing the duties of the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security.
Let's just say would-be acting Deputy Secretary.
Yeah, well, there's that. But so from their statements, Ben, I think what we have discovered is that the so-called Little Green Men are principally Customs and Border Protection officers, CBP, who have basically been they're augmenting the FPS response. Basically that, Federal Protective Service doesn't have a ton of manpower, and so the CBP officers are providing extra manpower for the FPS mission, which again is principally the protection of federal property and the enforcement of federal statutes that prohibit vandalism and damage to federal property.
So is Portland within 100 miles of the Canadian border?
It's not within 100 miles of the Canadian border. It is within 100 miles of the Pacific Ocean.
Oh, damn.
And so one of the sort of, so there's what we know, and then there are the conspiracy theories, right? And one of the sort of conspiracy theories out there is that it's also possible that the Trump administration, the question is, why, of all of the agencies to backstop the Federal Protective Service, why choose CBP, right? That's almost the biggest policy question here. And there are a couple of answers, none of which are especially laudatory. One answer is because CBP is, how do I say this, especially aggressive in carrying out its mission, that it's used to situations where it's dealing with individuals who don't have a lot of rights.
But is this also true of this is true of the Fourth Amendment? That was always the exception to all the Fourth Amendment cases was see, if you're within 100 miles, if you're driving through Vermont and you get within 100 miles of the Canadian border, we'll search your computer.
And so, Kate, then there's the border search question, which is, and then there's also the additional possibility that you're using CBP to further take advantage of the fact that at least technically under relatively dated Supreme Court precedent, they're in the border zone.
But all right, hang on. Before we get to the question of which law enforcement officers you're using, and you've been pretty delicate about this, I'll be pretty blunt. CBP is kind of not the elite of federal law enforcement, shall we say, and there are.
Don't let them hear you say that. You're screwed now, Ben. If you ever want to get,
I'm a citizen, man. They can come up to me and demand my papers, and I'll proudly produce them.
I mean, Ben, I just lost a Supreme Court case where the question was, should CBP officers be liable for damages when they violate clearly established constitutional rights? And the Supreme Court said no, at least in part because it's CBP. I mean,
right.
So the fact that it's CBP, I think, raises a whole bunch of alarm bells.
But there are some alarm bells go off before it's CBP, which is that they are not identifying themselves, and they're walking around exercising what sure seems like the police power, which, granted, as a constitutional matter, if they're there protecting federal facilities, then it's not. But to the person who they're stopping and pushing into a truck, it feels like they're patrolling the streets without identifying themselves, which is something that a local police department would not be able to do. And so I want to, before we get into the CBP versus, if they were Secret Service or FBI, I want to focus on the question of, like, if somebody walks up to you on the street in combat gear and claims to be police or law enforcement and orders you to get in a car, that sure seems like a kidnapping to me. And I'm just, we know that law enforcement does have the authority to go undercover sometimes, but they usually don't use their arrest power while undercover. So just walk us through, what authority do they have to be little green men as opposed to CBP uniformed in whatever gear, but who are producing appropriate credentials when asked?
So, there's a really good lawfare post from June 12th by Rachel Brown and Coleman Saunders that walks through some of this. The short version is that, for better or for worse, there is no requirement under federal law today that federal law enforcement officers provide specific identification beyond that they are a federal law enforcement officer at the time they effectuate an arrest. Now, the identity of the officer and the agency that he or she is representing is presumably part of any subsequent showing to the magistrate before whom the arrestee is supposed to be produced within 48 hours if it's a warrantless arrest. But, there's no requirement under current law, and perhaps there should be, that federal officers have to identify either themselves or their specific agency at the time of arrest. Now, in contrast, right, there are a number of states that do require, if not overt identification, at least a specific identification of, if not the agency you're part of, the offense that you're arresting for, right? You have to say, I am arresting you because I have probable cause to believe that you have committed the offense of vandalism, right? Or some such thing. And what I think is especially jarring about what's happening in Oregon is that there are multiple, I think, credible media reports that that's not happening on the ground. And, for all the folks who have been coming after me on Twitter over the last day and a half about how, these are felons and, how dare you suggest that they can't be arrested? If these were felons being arrested on serious charges, they'd be booked, right? And in fact,
just disappeared.
Right, and the stories that are out there are that there are a handful of folks who were arrested, and then quickly released. Which, we can have a separate conversation about catch and release, but that suggests to me that these are not individuals on whom the arresting officer had probable cause to believe they committed serious offenses.
I'm sorry. Normally, when the FBI arrests you for a serious offense, they identify themselves as the FBI.
Yes, because it's good practice. It's good practice.
But it's good practice. It's just a norms thing. It's not actually required. So,
we saw this last month in D.C. One of the things that came out of D.C. last month was a lot of folks being really surprised at the extent to which federal law enforcement officers are not legally required to identify either themselves or their employer.
Right. But I do think, look, I'm a D.C. resident. I am outraged about the way D.C. is treated in a lot of ways. I do think D.C. is a special case for federal purposes, and there's at least a little bit of a difference. When you walk around D.C., you're used to seeing federal law enforcement on the streets, whether it's the Federal Protective Service or the Secret Service cars in front of every embassy, or the National Park Service police people, right? The DC has or the Capitol Police, right? You have this all DC residents have a reasonably high comfort level with federal law enforcement as a kind of daily part of our lives. And, some people like that more than other people, but it's a fact of life in DC. It is not a fact of life in Portland, Oregon. And by the way, I have never interacted other than and I didn't interact with them because I was staying at home quarantining, but during the protests in DC, when there were unidentified federal law enforcement people out on the streets, that was highly unusual in DC. It seems to me a very different thing to be essentially abducted by somebody in combat gear in Portland, Oregon, who merely claims to be federal law enforcement.
So, I mean, I agree with that. I would say I have two
and I'm
different
not
reactions.
defending it in D.C.
What's
I'm just
that?
saying,
Yeah.
I said I'm not defending it in
Yeah, yeah.
D.C. I think it's bad in D.C. It's just that, like, I see federal law enforcement in D.C. literally every day. And it doesn't, the idea that there would be somebody who would be, we see uniformed Secret Service all the time.
So, at the risk of causing trouble, I think you live, Ben, and work in parts of D.C. where that's more likely than other parts of D.C. I mean, I think there are large swaths of Northeast and Southeast where the D.C. PD is the only, and maybe the Metro Police are the only law enforcement agencies people come into contact with. But
so first of all, I don't think that's true, because the local park that they go to is probably a national park.
That's fine. I mean, this is, but your point is well taken. So I have two different responses. One is sort of a policy response, and one's a legal one. So the policy response is it's incredibly dangerous, right? Because you are in effect incentivizing private individuals to resist what might be perfectly lawful arrests.
Right.
And that, in theory, puts the officer at far more potential for harm if the arrestee is actually incentivized to resist with force. That's my sort of my policy reactions. Like, it's a bad idea. My legal reaction is this is why I think we've seen the Oregon Attorney General bring a lawsuit against the relevant federal agencies because, I mean, I think the mayor of D.C. probably could attempt a similar type of lawsuit, but yes, again, you run into sovereignty problems. Whereas in Oregon, I mean, yes, there's federal property in Oregon, and there are federal laws that apply even on Oregon property in Oregon, right? I just think that the notion that we are the notion I'm hearing from, like, right-wing Twitterati, which maybe is not the right place to frame this conversation, that we shouldn't have any problem with federal officers purporting to enforce unidentified federal laws while unmarked and driving unmarked vehicles. That just strikes me as a recipe for disaster. I think the question is, how do you legislate around it? And I think, I think it is possible to think about how you could write a statute that would require federal law enforcement officers, when effectuating an arrest, to identify themselves plainly as federal law enforcement officers, to identify the agency that they are an officer of, and in the statute, where necessary to protect the officer's safety, to identify the name of the officer, right? I mean, I think that's not the law today, but I think it's a worthy conversation about whether it ought to be the law going forward.
Why? What is the whole? What possible reason do they have for does government have for not instituting such a law? I think, and I'm also curious to know what of the state statutes that you mentioned before you would use as a model for such a federal law. So New York has it's called the right to know, and like the police have to give you a literal business card that like lets you know. And it's like the equivalent of like papers, please, that like the state has all these rights to demand your identification. Why shouldn't the state have to identify itself? It just seems like good business practice. You don't want people going around in like claiming to be federal officers.
So, Kate, I mean, the claim that I don't remember if it was Morgan or Cuccinelli, but one of them on Twitter in one of their chest thumping tweets it insisted that the anonymity was necessary to protect the officer's safety because officers had been doxxed and their personal information posted online, and that not identifying the arresting officer was therefore essential. Now, the same thing, I mean, I am loath to compare anything that's going on in Portland to Guantanamo, but this is the same thing that happens at Guantanamo. Guantanamo, if you go to Guantanamo, the Army guards are all wearing, it's a joint task force. The military, folks who are serving as guards, they all are wearing their uniform with their rank insignia, but with their name badges. But here's the thing is, those name badges still have identifying information. It's just not their names. Like, I am Officer 46, right? Or something like that.
There's no excuse to not I mean, unless there's a unless you're undercover on an individualized basis for some very good reason, there is no good reason why, for the exact policy reason that you started with, which is, if I can walk up to you in the street and claim to be a federal law enforcement officer and demand that you get in my car, and
I
that
don't know
is
that these people
called
in Oregon
kidnapping.
are federal officers, actually. Like, I kind of would almost say, like, we don't, with everything else that's going on right now, would it be the craziest thing if it turned out that Proud Boys had gotten a bunch of things in unmarked vans and thrown people in the vans?
I mean, at the risk
So
of
we
causing
have a
real trouble, imagine if these officers were black, right? I mean, that. I mean, it's just a recipe
right.
for disaster. And the, of all the things I find offensive about what's been going on this week, the false machismo of Wolf, Cuccinelli, and Morgan, and basically sort of saying, we're restoring order. Like, everyone on the ground in Portland is saying that they're making it worse. Right? Not and that they're only exacerbating the situation, not helping it. Like, I'm not trying to sort of deny that that things in Portland are a mess, but this kind of, like, show of force that no one asked for, in a context in which the officers are not identifying themselves, in a context in which they seem to be not even processing most of the arrestees on any charges. To me, it might not be flagrantly illegal, but if anything, that's as much an indictment of our current laws, right, as it is a defense.
That's right. It shows a real gap in the law. Dan has a question. We've got a bunch of great questions in the queue, so I'm just going to start rotating people in. I may read some of them myself because some people are shy about having their faces on camera, but fortunately, Dan is not. Dan, the floor is yours.
Hello. So you just said it's a recipe for disaster. What's going on? And I'm shocked and appalled at what's going on, and I'm wondering, how do you deal with a recipe for disaster? What can be done on the federal level? Like, we have congressional Republicans who are unwilling to do anything. We write them off. Is there anything that states or the Dems can do to actually do something rather than just issue statements?
So, I mean, I saw the suggestion online. It's not. I wish I could credit whose idea it was. I don't remember, but it's not mine originally. So one idea is to tie to any subsequent coronavirus stimulus legislation or any other must-pass legislation a spending proviso that prevents use of the CBP to augment the Federal Protective Service, right? And that actually says, like, in circumstances in which the FPS is not able to do its job, one, the president has to certify, right, that FPS can't do its job, and two, the agencies that can be called upon to back up FPS are, and then list them, right? So you could, by law, you could cut CBP out of the force augmentation pipeline. I think the broader reform about identification is, I think, something that ought to be part of the police reform legislation that, the House is still, I think, debating. Because I think it's much broader than, like, that to me is a bigger deal than just Trump, right? Like, some of this is Trumpy and some of this is not just Trumpy. And so I would love to see it sort of cash out in those two different directions. Because I think otherwise there's nothing to stop. I mean, Cuccinelli said on NPR, I think this morning, that this is a test, and that they basically want to take this nationwide. And I think, that's exactly where I think we should be worried about this sort of going further.
All right, we have a question from Ann Burns, who prefers not to be on screen. Please talk about the injunction that the Oregon Attorney General has requested, its merits, its likelihood of success, and how it might be enforced.
So, this would be like the Attorney General lawsuit?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the the Attorney General is basically, I think, principally seeking information. I mean, the lawsuit is styled as an injunction against the relief being sought is an injunction, I think, and declaratory judgment against unlawful arrests. Of course, that assumes that the arrests are unlawful. And I think, what I think the Attorney General is really trying to do, which I think is quite clever, is get to a point where the federal government has to go on the record with sort of under the pain of perjury, right, about exactly what's going on, exactly who's been arrested for which offenses. I want to say, I mean, Ben, I hope this was clear from my post last night, because it wasn't clear to a lot of the folks who said they read it. No one is suggesting that federal law enforcement officers lack the power to arrest for federal crimes, right? I think what folks are up in arms about is a legitimate concern that these arrests are not for federal crimes, right? That the federal crimes that have been identified by Cuccinelli and Morgan and Wolf, the vandalism, the graffiti, the destruction of property, which are all federal crimes, are not why a bunch of these folks have been arrested. And so, I think to me, the most likely outcome of the lawsuit is actually probably no relief at the end, because we'll get to a point where it actually, where things get mooted out, or where the specific arrested issue turned out to have been, substantiated by probable cause of some crime, right? But where it's principally an information gathering function, and I think that's why that's where I think we'll get the most practical use out of this litigation.
Can I
and
ask?
what do you make of the U.S. Attorney's comments that he was looking at certain of the arrests?
I thought so. Of everything that we heard yesterday, the statement that I was the most surprised to hear was from Billy Williams, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Oregon, who formally requested that the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security open an investigation into what DHS and CBP are doing in Portland. And I guess I'm surprised by that, because suffice it to say, this is an administration that has made quite clear that U.S. attorneys serve at the pleasure of the president. And so, I think this is yet a further signal from, a DOJ official, and not just a DOJ official, but one who is there with the president's, at least for now, backing. That there are real concerns about what the CBP folks are doing. I'm not sure if Billy Williams is going to be the U.S. attorney for much longer at this rate. But,
I have a feeling we know who the next U.S. attorney to get fired is going to be.
Can I ask what really quickly to tag on to this, unless I don't want to preempt, well, maybe I'm preempting, ironically, Ben's question, but could we talk a little bit about preemption and the Supremacy Clause and kind of Oren's pushback to you? Because I didn't I thought your response to Oren was great, but I'm not sure everyone saw it. And so just kind of talk about that a little, because I do think that there is a little bit of conversation to be had here about the role of the federal government in helping police, helping state police, but not the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, so Oren Kerr tweeted late last night that he disagreed. That he said that he disagreed with the part of my post that suggested that the federal officers could be subject to Oregon state law. And with all respect to Oren, I think he misread what I wrote, because what the post was trying to do is it was trying to distinguish between two different exercises of law enforcement authority. Federal law enforcement officers have the power to enforce federal law in Oregon. Oregon law be damned, right? That's the Supremacy Clause. That a federal law enforcement officer cannot be stopped from, charged with, right, a violation of Oregon state law if he is enforcing a valid federal statute. What I was pointing out in the post was that Oregon also allows federal law enforcement officers to enforce state law, but with caveats, with conditions, one of which is they have to identify themselves, one of which is they have to be certified that they've been properly trained to enforce Oregon state law. And suffice to say, I'm going to go out on a limb and say none of these CBP officers have received the requisite certification. And so what I was suggesting in the post was, insofar as they were arresting people based on violations of state law, right, I didn't think that was authorized by Oregon state law, and therefore it would be unlawful. right? Because federal law does not generally authorize federal law enforcement officers to arrest for state crimes unless the state crimes are committed on federal property, and then they're a federal crime under a statute called the Assimilative Crimes Act, right? And so
would that include sovereign property or tribal property rather, or no?
Yes. So tribal property comes under different criminal statutes, right? So the Major Crimes Act, which was the subject of the recent Supreme Court case, is part of that story, right? But the short version is, unless you're on federal property, federal law enforcement officers generally lack the power as a matter of federal law to arrest for violations of state law. Right? And that's where I think Orrin and I were talking past each other. The Supremacy Clause, I think, is not contested here. Like, insofar as federal officers are enforcing federal law, they win. I mean, that's just thus lies the Supremacy Clause. Part of why Congress passed something called the Federal Officer Removal Statute, which allows federal officers to remove civil and criminal cases from state court to federal court, was for circumstances in which federal officers were being prosecuted under state law for doing their job under federal law, right? And so, I don't think there's any daylight between Orrin and me about what the Supremacy Clause does in this context, right? I think it's just that the messy question that's still not clear to me is exactly which federal laws were these CBP officers enforcing if they're not on federal property and if they didn't witness the arrestees commit a federal crime.
Okay, we have a question from Zach Bliss, who is, I am trying to get up on the screen. Zach, if you can hear this, come join us. In the meantime, do you want to introduce the baby, Kate?
Oh, this is not my baby. We haven't had the pandemic for that long. This is Juniper. She's my friend's baby who has access to a lot of asymptomatic COVID tests, so was able to come visit. And so she's, we're doing some babysitting. And so she's just kind of hanging out. She's a very chill baby.
She's a very chill baby.
She's a very chill
Zach
baby.
Zach Bliss, the floor is yours.
Hi, Zach.
Questions for Steve Vladeck or Juniper?
I almost just want to ask baby a question. It's just too cute. But okay. So this just seems kind of like a white supremacist, accelerationist wet dream in a sense, this kind of situation. And if I were one of them, I would kind of want to join the CBP right now. And people of that bent are joining similar agencies around the world these days, it seems like. Like Germany just disbanded a group of special forces because it was infiltrated. So I guess my question is, what defenses do the CBP have, your agencies like the CBP have against that? And two, like, do we have the power to see that they are being enforced, that those defenses are being used? Like, can I tell, or can we tell that they're even applying those defenses?
It's a really interesting question. Steve, do you have thoughts on it? I have a few, but you should go first.
I guess I have a couple. I mean, so when I first started yesterday to try to write the post that I think is why I'm now here, I was actually reacting to a different vibe, which was progressives who were critical of the notion that the federal government ever has any business enforcing laws in American cities, right? And right. I think it's critical to keep in mind that there are any number of contexts, historical and present, where we want federal law enforcement of federal law, and indeed that the civil rights movement at many moments depended upon federal enforcement of federal laws in states that didn't want them, right? So I think we have to be careful to sort of not categorically oppose this idea. The problem, as I think the question raises, the problem is, who are the people doing the enforcing and why are they there? And that's where I think, going back to where we were half an hour ago, the fact that it's CBP is part of what the alarm bells are all about. Because I think that, there was an amicus brief in the Supreme Court case I lost this year, Hernandez, from former CBP officers, talking about just how terrible the culture in that agency is when it comes to accountability, when it comes to compliance with their own internal regulations about excessive force, right, and all kinds of similar things. And so, I don't think CBP wants to keep those kinds of folks out. And I think that's sort of why, from a structural reform perspective, I would think about limiting the ability to use CBP as a force augmenting body in any context. If not, sort of thinking about how to impose greater standards on CBP, in the first place.
There's so much control and latitude the executive branch has, and in terms in the jurisdiction of immigration, which I always kind of have. That is the lens in which I have understood the CBP to have so much power. Is that kind of correct? Are those related?
Yeah, I mean, so CBP, this all dates back to when Congress broke apart the former INS, right, in the middle of the George W. Bush administration. Because INS used to be one massive agency, and it used to be within the Department of Justice. And when Congress broke INS apart, it broke it into CBP, ICE, and USCIS, right? And it moved them all into the new Department of Homeland Security. So, Kate, to me, part of it is also just this structural phenomenon of DHS versus DOJ. And I think that's true not just in the abstract, right? But also
interesting. I'd never thought of it like that. That's a much better way to think of it.
And I would just add to that, and it's not just DHS versus DOJ in the abstract. It's DHS today, right? Day 466 without a Senate-confirmed secretary or nominee, right? With no Senate-confirmed officials in the top 11 posts in the agency. And so I think, there are ways in which DHS can be manipulated by the White House that I think DOJ can't be, that I think are coming to light. We're seeing that play out in front of us. And again, I mean, I don't want to lose the thread that there is a story here about appropriate federal law enforcement and about FPS having the prerogative and having the obligation, right, to protect federal property. I think the question is, are we actually convinced that we needed any augmentation, that FPS was not up to the task in Portland? And if so, my question for the relevant decision makers is, why did you choose CBP? Because I think the answers are all bad.
Yeah, I agree with that. So
terrifying, actually.
Just a couple things to add to Steve's points here. There are federal investigative entities that have to have and that really do work on good community relations. It's not that they don't get stressed. It's not that they're not. But if you're an organization that, for example, investigates organized crime, you've got to have a relationship with whatever the usually ethnic or national community that the organized crime groups you're dealing with are from, in order to, whether it's the Italian mafia or triads or the Russian mob, right? You've got to be able to you've got to have relationships with that community that are going to enable you to get inside, and that need for those relationships is limiting. But if you're CBP, you don't actually have to have good community relations, because all you're really actually doing is removing people. And of course, ICE is the interior enforcement, but this is not a community relations based type of activity, and you're detaining people, you're monitoring borders, and you're manning checkpoints, basically, right? And you're doing investigations of land, and that's a very different project. It's also a very large organization. The number of officers is, I don't. It's been a while since I've looked at what it is, but it's gigantic.
It's the largest law enforcement agency in the entire country.
Right, and and when you're that big,
CBP is? Yeah, that doesn't actually surprise me at all. If you have ever looked at one of those maps,
we got a lot of miles of border.
Yeah, if you've ever
and so
looked at one of those
you're
maps of its jurisdiction, it's insane.
You end up scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of quality.
And I should just say, I mean, there's a story that just went up on the New York Times that I think is echoing a Politico report from a few hours ago. The headline of which is, "Federal officers deployed in Portland didn't have proper training," DHS memo said. This reinforces the point. Like, why did you choose, of all of the tens of thousands of federal law enforcement officers who you could have sent to Portland to help the poor, beleaguered Federal Protective Service, right? Why did you choose these guys?
So,
Ben, what's happening with your camera?
I don't know.
Are you okay?
Yeah. This is
it's like
me.
Kate. It's like in Sneakers where they raise the temperature of the room to white out the infrared.
Exactly. That's almost. That was like I was going to. Oh, there it goes. It's just gone now. So Steve, I don't have the power to, but I'm going to ask Ben at some point. No, Ben, it's still so you're still like this like
abstract art.
You are abstract art right now.
I kind of. This is actually the real me.
Is the camera looking into your soul and broadcasting?
The camera's looking into my soul, and this is.
I think it's infrared.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's CBP is using it.
Is there any chance? And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here. Is there any chance that these aren't actually federal agents? I'm quite people don't seem to be giving that much shrift, and that makes me think that I'm like being maybe like I just am so distrustful of everything I see these days. But is that kind of like the boring answer in which we don't have anything to say about that if that's actually what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, is there any chance, Kate? Yeah, is there a significant? Now
you're good, Ben.
Is there a significant chance, Kate? I think
I switched the camera to my laptop.
So the Times story that just went up talks about how these officers are from BORTAC, which is the Border Patrol's equivalent of a SWAT team, right? I mean, I have to think that like if you're going to go this route and you're going to choose CBP, it's because you want the CBP officers, right? Not the Joe Schmoes. And so, Kate, there's a related conversation about the dangers of outsourcing some of this to contractors. But I actually think this is probably this probably is, right? BORTAC and CBP sort of, SWAT team-like folks who, by the way, are not ever trained for riot control.
I think there's part of me that just like doesn't want to believe we've reached this, that like the federal government, even though I know better, it just seems like such dark days.
Well, so everything else. I mean, of the things that I am frustrated, there are the things I'm nervous about the story, and there are the things that I'm just like angry about, right? And the lectures that conservative Republicans have been delivering for decades about states' rights are ringing a little hollow, in Oregon right now.
Just a little,
right? And so, I just, not for the first time and not for the last time. Like, I am not shocked that the Trump administration is taking an unusually creative approach to authorities that have never been used in this way for a reason. Right? I'm shocked that like no one in the Republican leadership, many of whom would say on the spot that they are ardent supporters of states' rights. Apparently they're supporters of red states' rights, and in that respect, I don't think it's a surprise that this is Oregon as opposed to say Texas.
They're supporters of blue state rights to do things they agree with too.
But I guess again, I mean, no one should be attacking the idea that the federal government is entitled to enforce federal law even in cities, right? That I think is not the issue. The question is,
and even over the objection of the local officials.
Even over the objection of local officials, agreed. Right. The question is,
because otherwise you never integrate Little Rock.
That's right. That's exactly right. The question is, although we should talk about the military.
What a great. Yeah, good reference, Ben.
But we should talk about the military too. But the question has to be like, is it actually necessary? to use federal law enforcement. And again, right, is that actually what's happening? Are these CBP officers arresting for federal offenses? And if so, can someone please tell us which offenses?
Right.
So
do you know if Popat has had any, or sorry, Ken White has had any luck in tracking down people that need habeas petitions and things like that?
I don't know if he does. I know the ACLU also filed a lawsuit this morning, which I think was at least nominally on behalf of a couple of the individuals who were arrested.
Okay.
So, I suspect there will be more information that comes out in the next, in the coming days and weeks. And I should say, I think we all owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Oregon Public Broadcasting, which really was at the bottom of getting all of this out onto the national, sort of media sphere. Local media actually is important. But
as our local people with phones,
Yep.
If you live in Portland, Oregon, and at least some people who are watching this I know do, make sure you have space on your phone for some video if you need to take it. It's really important that, when you see stuff, record it, because all of this stuff is going to be litigated, and whether everything's going to turn, since it won't, as Steve rightly says, it will not turn on whether the feds have an obligation to identify themselves. It will turn on whether they had probable cause to make the arrest that they made. Not, by the way, whether they had a warrant for the arrest.
So,
whether they had probable cause for the arrest.
Right. We should be clear on this, right? That there are two very different kinds of arrests in law enforcement land, right? There is a warranted arrest, which is when a warrant is out for you for a specific crime, and the warrant has been signed by a magistrate. At which point, officers of any number of law enforcement agencies might be executing the warrant to arrest you. And then there is the so-called warrantless arrest, which is only possible when the officer has probable cause to believe that you, the arrestee, committed a particular crime that the officer has the authority to arrest you for, right? And all of the arrests we're talking about here are the latter.
Incident to lawful arrest. Sorry.
Well, there's a whole mess of Fourth Amendment doctrine that's getting in the way here. But so I have to say, what I think really is the big takeaway here, though, is that Congress really needs to move quickly, even if it can't. I think it ought to be a priority for House Democrats to actually not only have hearings into this, but to tie up funding for anything related to CBP until there are answers about this, and indeed to perhaps attach the kind of spending proviso we were discussing, that CBP can't be used for force augmentation. And, maybe not limit that to CBP. Or, if you want to go one better, you can't use any agency that doesn't currently have a Senate-confirmed director. But however it does, the outrage here needs to turn into action. And I think the action is not just litigation. The action also needs to be legislative as well.
I agree with that.
100.
One other thought that I had about stuff that could happen, which is I agree with both you and Oren that to the extent that federal law enforcement is lawfully engaged in federal law enforcement, it trumps any Oregon state laws. But to the extent that federal law enforcement officers charge across the street and are not meaningfully protecting a facility, but are going after somebody who's without probable cause, that is presumably kidnapping under Oregon law. And I do think for Oregon to make clear that if you're a federal law enforcement officer operating in Oregon and you step out of line and exceed your jurisdiction and violate someone's civil rights in a fashion that violates Oregon law, they will prosecute the shit out of you, would be a healthy thing for the Oregon law enforcement to make clear. How far that gets you, of course, depends on how many of these CBP officers are behaving appropriately under the guidance that they've been given and can plausibly be said to be operating within federal law. But to the extent they're not, Oregon has a law enforcement interest, a sovereign law enforcement interest of its own in making sure that federal law enforcement officers don't come in there and kidnap people.
And then we're basically back to the 1850s and the fight over the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850.
Yes, I think that's right. Which brings us to cannons, because like
we
had
fought
to make
for our
the transition.
union with cannons.
We did, although the cannons that we fought with did not look like blue cucumbers. This one, however, looks like a blue cucumber. And we are going to use it to attack baby Prosecco and hopefully destroy it once and for all. But I need to put on ear protection and eye protection.
Steve, are you familiar with this ongoing saga?
So I think I've lost track of why we're destroying a Prosecco bottle.
It's because someone gave Ben a baby Prosecco, and then it turns out that baby Proseccos are very strong bottles, and then so they became the target of baby cannons, many baby cannons. No baby cannon has yet to pierce
Got it.
the
Baby Prosecco has scorch marks on her, and she's now I have loaded this cannon, which has been 3D printed for me by my son, with an excessive amount of black powder, and the fuse is very thin. So I'm going to light this and get the hell out of here, and we'll just see what happens.
This is amazing.
Seems like a waste of Prosecco.
What a time to be alive. Oh my God. Did it do it?
Baby Prosecco survived.
Oh my God.
I don't think the cannon survived.
Oh
no. We're going to have to investigate and see what happened. We will give a full after-action report. Ooh, it broke my computer.
It broke your computer?
It did.
What's wrong with it?
The screen is dead.
Oh, no.
Oh, because we can see you.
We can see you. Fine.
Oh, the camera is not dead, but the screen is dead.
It broke your computer and hit it?
Something did.
Ben, this is terrible news.
So Prosecco 2, computer 0.
It's going to end it's going to make it very hard to end the broadcast.
Wow. This is going to be the longest in lieu of fun ever.
It's going to be in lieu of a lot of things.
In lieu of my MacBook. All right. Well, on that cheerful note, I'm going to see if I can get my computer screen up so I can end this broadcast. But we will see you tomorrow, probably from a different computer.
You might just have to shut the computer down. I'm really sad. I'm still at your computer.
Yeah, I'm kind of worried about it. No, it's definitely the screen definitely took a hit. I guess it got a ricochet off of
we could do a GoFundMe to get you a new computer, Ben.
Baby Cannon could not destroy Baby Prosecco, but it did take out my computer.
MacBook.
All right.
We
will see you tomorrow. I think I will have had to acquire a new computer by then.
Oh my
Bye.
God.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Steve.
Thanks
for hanging out.
And this broadcast is now over, even though I can't hit stop on it because, my computer doesn't work.
Just turn off your computer, Ben. Bye.
Bye.